2. You'd think I'd have this figured out by now. And recording with Mr. Malcolm Hillgartner. How about you introduce yourself, sir?
I'm Malcolm Hillgartner. I'm an audiobook narrator, among other things, and I guess I've done about 250 some books so far. So, and
Jeez.
I got started late on this. I only picked it up about 2007, started doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. So and I just kind of like to ask questions off the top of my head, so you'll have to be patient with me with my simpleton questions. Um, so like what where do you see where do you see strengths and weaknesses in the sense, are there days where you go in and you're just on fire? Is it something that you can kind of just turn on no matter what? It's whether you're tired, you go in there and it's kind of, game face, dump the cold water on your head, or is it yeah.
Well, in a way, that's the very definition of professionalism. Is that you put on a good show, or you do a good job when you don't feel like it.
Mhm.
And there are days, I have to say, but for the most part, I always kind of pinch myself, feeling like, how lucky can I get that I can have a job where I can go to work in my underwear if I feel like it, back in that my room back there. I call it my pit of despair, but
Well,
I don't know
that's
if you
what
were a Princess Bride fan, but
yeah. Well, that's what I tell people about doing this podcast. I'm like, who knows? Am I wearing pants or not? That's the great mystery of every episode.
I mean, do I always have great books? No, but what I do have is constant stimulation in all sorts of different ways, intellectually, emotionally, depending on the material. This past month, say, I just finished doing a massive, literally yesterday, finished a massive book by a German author, sort of a retelling of the Faust story. So
Okay.
that'll give you an idea. And he kind of recast it as a political thriller in 16th century Europe,
Okay.
So a different take on a little bit of what's his face, Da Vinci Code kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. Before that, I did a really great history called American Hannibal
Okay.
by Jim Stemple, about General Daniel Morgan, who was the kind of genius behind the Battle of Cowpens in the Revolutionary
Mm-hmm.
War. That he makes I thought, a very good case about how that completely set up Yorktown. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
It got Cornwallis to change his strategy, and he wound up backing his way into Virginia, where he got pinned in by Washington and the French Navy out in the
Mm-hmm.
Chesapeake Bay. So I love that stuff, because I have to say, I probably love doing the history stuff the most.
Yeah.
I just eat it up, because I'm a history uh, nut. So
Yeah. I love in the last couple of years I've realized I graduated with a biology degree from the University of Georgia in 2013.
yeah,
Got into medical school, but decided I didn't want to go. Really, in the last 2 years, maybe 3 years, I've discovered just how much of a history buff I am for the Cold War.
just before you get
45
started,
to
I'm a lapsed pre-med myself.
really.
I started off in college, going pre-med, and kind of made a severe left turn into, theater and the arts and stuff like that. I discovered that, and I still do. I love science. I love reading about it. I love knowing about it. I got into a couple of labs,
Mhm.
in college, and I kind of went, "This isn't me."
Yeah.
I'm not cut out for this. So
Yeah.
I love reading about it, and
Yeah. Yeah, I went the whole way. I got into the University of Miami in Miller School of Medicine, and
uh,
I mean, it's all I did for 4 years was study, research. I published research. I shadowed I did the whole 9 yards. I did it, and I realized at the end, I was like, I think more than anything, I was proud of the fact that I did it, rather than like a true love for it. I was like, oh, cool, I did it. Again, all very interesting stuff: organic chemistry, biochemistry, molecular biology. It's all great, but I don't know if that's where my heart was for 40 years.
you got way further than I did. I have to say, it was a class in microbiology that kind of did me in. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's one class that just makes you realize, like, no. But
it's
yeah, for the Cold War, yeah, there are always things I learned that always, I mean, for lack of a more original term, blow my mind, where I realized just how just how absurd a lot of history is that we never learned about. I mean, the one analogy I always use is like think of Operation Paperclip, right? Under Curtis LeMay, bringing about 2/3 of the Nazi rocket scientists to the United States to develop liquid and solid fueled rockets, ultimately to be able to put ICBMs in Russia and then put us to the moon for a propaganda win. Imagine you're in 1947 America, right? Uncle Sam would never say anything that isn't in your best interest, right? Control, and I'm for better or worse, that's just what it was. Imagine if someone came to you and said, "Hey, there's a secret military base in the desert that Uncle Sam doesn't tell you about." Uncle Sam wouldn't lie to me. Who's there? You remember Hitler and all those guys that we killed them all 2 years ago? They're actually living there in really nice homes. No, they're not. What are they going to try to do? Actually, they're going to put us on the moon. That would be the most ridiculous conspiracy you'd ever heard, but that's exactly what happened. And
Yeah, but I have to say it wasn't necessarily a secret conspiracy. It was pretty
sure.
open. Because interestingly, I just narrated a book a couple months ago by David Nassau called The Last Million,
Okay.
which kind of dovetails a little bit with this. What you're talking about, and not in terms of the conspiracy part of it, but in terms of how messy history is.
Yeah.
Uh, at the end of World War II, there was something like 3 million refugees in Germany, most of whom were from either freed prisoners, the few remaining survivors of some of the death camps, a lot of Russians, a lot of and a lot of German prisoners, and hidden in among these refugees were a lot of uh, um, Nazi sympathizers
Mm-hmm.
or actually collaborationists. A lot of them from what are today Belarus, Lithuania, and Estonia, and it was pretty horrifying to read how the obsession after the end of World War II was root out the communists.
Mm-hmm.
And so meanwhile, we gave a pass
Mm-hmm.
to immigrate to this country to a lot of people who ultimately we found out
Were
were,
Nazis or
were Nazis,
sympathizers.
you know,
Yeah.
and but it was done, when on one hand you go, my God, in the space of less than a year, the Allied, the combined U.S., British, French, and whatever, were able to patriate roughly 3 million people in different countries around the world, or and particularly in the case of the Jews, there was no way that they were going to stay. The ones that survived that were going to stay in Germany,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and but we also we didn't want to get involved in what was the nascent looming problem in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we really want to try to keep hands off of that, and that didn't work.
Yeah.
But a lot of that stuff, you realize it's sort of like that old Indiana Jones thing. I don't know what I'm doing. We're making this up as we go along, and that's
Absolutely.
the way
100%.
history is. You know,
100%.
we always talk about that in terms of the battle, fog of battle.
Uh-huh.
All the greatest plans in the world, as soon as boots hit the ground, all hell
Doesn't
breaks.
matter. It's all, I think that's actually the best way to put it is it's very messy. It's not, in hindsight, we learn it as this very tucked in, and then this happened, and then Hitler came to power, and on this day he committed suicide. World War II was over, and then Mickey Mantle won a World Series, and it's just like da 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 da.
And in hindsight, we put all of these nice little lines together.
Uh-huh.
They all kind
Uh-huh.
of seem to make sense, and they all combine to put together a coherent narrative. And I'm always impressed with the historians that kind of say
Not at all.
it's a little more complicated than that.
It's
And
insane, is what it is. It's yeah. I mean, another one is Unit 731 in Japan, who, according to one historian, made the Nazis look like Boy Scouts. Some of the things they would do in Manchuria, including to United States servicemen. And we went in there at the end, and we took the highest up members of all of them, all the head biologists, head bioweapons guys, and we brought them all to the United States because the idea was
I was not aware of this.
that one gets that I heard it from Jocko Willink, a Navy SEAL who has a great podcast, but we brought them all to the United States because the idea was, it's again Nazis in Germany. It's like we should kill them all, but hey, if we don't have them, they're going to be with the Soviets. Which one's the greater evil? And it gets, I mean, you really start making these sort of dark deals when it comes to whole, national security. So Unit 7,
Information that we want.
yeah, Unit 731 was like, hey, these guys are demons from hell, but the information they have all the data. Here we know what these weapons now do to people. If we don't roll in there and take everything, the Soviets will. And
Yeah.
it's Truman with the hydrogen bomb. When briefed on it, his only question was, can the Soviets do it? And he was told within a couple of years. So he said, so we have to do it first.
Yeah.
It's That's what a lot of history, at least in my limited, I guess, understanding and reading of history, is just how many deals with like the devil, or how many deals with bad people are made so that you don't have to deal with the devil, if that makes sense.
That's the hope.
That's the hope, yeah. And then I don't know, and then you get into this whole cliche, do we become the devil in the meantime? Who knows? But it's yeah, that's what a lot of reading it. But for me, that's what I listen to on Audible. But you actually, so you read this stuff, and that's where you take in a lot of this.
Yeah, well, sometimes I feel like since I started doing this, because of so many different books that I've read, I feel like I've been going to permanent graduate school, in various forms, not necessarily because lately, probably for the last 3 or 4 years, I would say the bulk of what I do is nonfiction.
Yeah.
And because of my background, my dad worked for the Voice of America, and so
Okay.
we were stationed in North Africa for many years in Morocco, and as a result, although I don't speak Arabic, I'm very conversant with a lot of it, and very comfortable pronouncing a lot of Middle Eastern languages. And so what's happened to me is that a lot of books that are about either the situation or the history of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East and stuff like that, I've wound up getting a lot of those because I can handle the pronunciations of all the
Hmm.
various names and stuff. It's a long way of saying it. Just a lot of stuff has come my way that I probably would not have necessarily read
Yeah. Yeah.
first, you
Yeah.
know, and uh, and it's been a real education. It's been really good.
What are some of the like oddest parallels or dots you've connected through all these things you read? Like I find myself making the oddest analogies. I'll be talking about the Cold War, but I'll relate it to organic chemistry or something.
Well, I don't know about, yeah. Oh, that's
Well,
interesting. I
what? So something like, of all the books you've read, you start to see like The Alchemist. They talk, in the book. I can never pronounce his last name. Paulo Coelho.
Oh yeah,
But he talks about how like all the secrets of the universe can be written on like a grain of sand. Like there's only a couple. They just manifest in different ways. We see them as, if you wake up early, get to the gym for, okay, early bird gets the worm. Now that can take shape in a million different ways, or it's do unto others as you would like to have come to you. We can see that in a million different, karma's a bitch, blah blah blah. But there's only like a couple real, everyone dies in the end. Like, but I found that you can kind of find those lessons in different things. I mean, you could say immigration as well as like active diffusion in a cell, like, only so many can come in.
okay. Along those lines, and it's maybe a little not Pollyannish on my part, but one of the things that's really come through to me in terms of reading a lot of contemporary history or recent history, going back to say uh, 20th century history and beyond, and more 21st history more recently, is that I come away with, I guess, more empathy for the various actors involved.
Yeah.
By that I mean, I see people trying to do their best.
Yeah.
They inevitably and invariably F it up,
Mhm.
but they're trying. So then you get to I mean, there was all the stuff about the best and the brightest in the early 60s, right? And how that didn't work out very well, blah blah blah, whatever. But it's always that way. We always try to get the best. People are in foreign policy and in the military, strategies in terms of creating all this. They're trying to make the best of what they can see. It's just that we're like those, what is those wise men in India, and the
Yeah.
body of the camel or
Yeah.
whatever, the elephant, only seeing one piece of the pie at any given time. And so necessarily the vision is limited. A really good example of this was a series, two really terrific books by the journalist Steve Call. One of them was they're both about the from the lens of the CIA, American involvement in Afghanistan,
Okay.
starting from the Soviet invasion in '89 or so, all the way up through. He finally brought it up to fairly well. I read the second book about a year ago, so that he brought it up that far. And I'm looking at. It doesn't matter who the actors are, Democrat, Republican, uh, Iranian, whatever. They're all trying to do the best they can.
Yeah.
He does a good job of kind of demonizing the Pakistani Secret Service, but they got a lot to answer for.
They do.
Uh,
Osama and Abbottabad.
oh boy, oh, but and on the other hand, kind of look as they see themselves as protecting their country. So
Yeah.
I guess the point is I'm getting at that I see a lot of people trying really hard, and I'm thinking in terms of the lens of American involvement. I see a lot of different actors, many of whose names we know and have heard of, and they're on either side of the ideological spectrum. I can't look at these people and go, well, you're a jerk and you're a hero. I'm going, man, I just see people trying to get in there and do something.
Yeah.
And lots of times they just don't get it right.
Yeah.
And we pay for it over and over again.
Yeah.
That's the big lesson I learned.
I would say that's not, completely just taking credit for what you just said. That's now I can kind of look back and I would say that that's applicable. Yeah. It's very easy to, he was X, he was Y, and they were evil. And a lot of times it's guys like you and me who are fighting for the place that they know as home, for the people that they know as family, for the land that they know as their childhood homeland, and they're going to fight to the death for that. If I do it, I call it patriotism. I look at, that what the CIA does, I'm like, it's for national security. But if I'm in Guatemala and a bunch of white guys and private jets came down and just toppled my democratically elected government, now they look at us as we're evil. But if they asked me, I'd be like, we're trying to do the best we can for this area. And it's like, man,
which makes it even more bitter when sometimes it's characterized as you're going to go and preserve democracy but basically what you're doing is preserving an economic
paradigm,
big trough for some corporation. I'm thinking in terms of Central America.
Yeah,
we have a lot to answer for in terms of our political involvement in Central America for the last 100 years because of that, but it's something we can deal with, but we never get anywhere when we demonize the players, because then all it does is make people, back into their positions and they dig in. It's just a matter, you look at it, you try to analyze it and find a way to move forward in a way that acknowledges the mistakes, if they were mistakes of the past, recognize the successes, and try to build on them. I guess that's about all we can do reasonably, but seems to be really hard.
have you heard of General Smedley Butler, retired in 1933?
Yeah.
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 Oh, not a lot of people have.
I'm trying to think of what context did it just come up?
South America, government involvement for big business. Oh, you mean in our conversation or in general?
No. I was just reading. His name just came up in something I was reading.
Yeah.
That's the other thing too. Sometimes I feel like I have Halfheimers.
Yeah.
I remember something of it, but I don't remember the real meat of it. And because so much is bouncing through the brain. But I just remember reading about him recently, and I can't remember the context. It'll come to me when we talk about something else.
Yeah. He is, in my mind, he gave the military industrial complex speech 30 years before Eisenhower. And he's a guy that went in like the 1890s, maybe 1880s, was in every conflict, rose through the ranks. I think he's the most decorated Marine in American history, through World War I, Caribbean.
Was he involved in the Spanish-American War?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's the context that I read it.
Yeah. He was involved in. So as he rose up through the ranks, and he finally got out, and in 1933, J.P. Morgan and some other big players, I think the grandfather of George Bush, Prescott Bush, they wanted him to take the bonus army, which were a bunch of veterans from World War I that had yet to receive their bonus. So in 1933, like 14 years later, And on a side note, if that's not I guess, a timeless tale of us not taking care of our veterans, but they kind of gathered on the National Mall in like 1933, and they wanted their bonus, and they had General Smedley Butler would go speak to him. These guys loved him. A lot of them fought with him. They got their wounds with him, and he was always right there with them. And these two big business guys, Morgan and Prescott Bush, they came to him under the guise of like, hey, you should rally all them together, and what we'll do is we're going to go get them their money. But Smedley Butler was this, he didn't fall off the truck yesterday. He kind of waited out, and he was like, let's hear him out.
That's
Yeah,
that's what came up. It was in 33. You're right.
business
That's
plot.
where I read about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
If it wasn't for him, we probably would have had a ultra
fascist.
wing, a fascist takeover of the
Yep, yep.
yeah.
And yeah, it's something we don't learn about in school. It's the business plot, capital B, capital P, the business plot of 1933. They came to him, and they said, "Hey, we're doing this to go get the money for all the soldiers." And he was kind of like, "Okay," and he kind of waited it out and kind of played dumb like a fox, and found out what they wanted was for him to use this army of veterans to go overthrow the White House, take out FDR, and they wanted to reestablish gold as the backing of our fiat currency. And he said, like, this is basically treason, and but because he went along with it, just like just guy was a machine, went along with it and exposed it. But I say all that to say he had a great quote about about what he learned over his years rising through the ranks. And it culminated with like, I thought I was going there, behind the flag. I thought I was going to do this. And he's like, what I have truly learned is, you know, it's too coincidental that every time something happens where Wall Street can't make their money here, or where this company, Dole all of a sudden they don't have the rights to the bananas and wherever, or, Standard Oil all of a sudden can't go unfettered into the Middle East. Ironically enough, within a couple of years, we have a conflict, and I have to go in there with the hand of God and establish peace. And he goes, I realized years later, that I am the muscle man for these business interests. He said, unless we are protecting our shores, our borders, or the Bill of Rights, if it's not one of those, it's a racket. And that's where he coined the war as a racket. And he goes, after World War I, there are a lot of millionaires and even a couple billionaires minted. And he goes on to say, he goes, I've worked as a muscle man for all these big business interests. And at the end, he has one line where he goes, I could probably give Al Capone a few pointers. He operated in 3 counties. I operated on 3 continents. And say all that to say, that's another theme I've started to pick up in history is, you can kind of pick out what's the one underlying thing of really all conflict. Someone somewhere is making a ton of money. And I don't really know why I just went on that whole rant, but yeah, that's.
Well, I can't. I certainly agree with you. Yeah, and actually, though, is there a specific book that you're describing here that where he talks about this, or was it an article or something? Because I'd like to read more about this.
Yeah, no, I was gonna pull it up earlier. So he has a book that I haven't listened to yet, but someone narrated. Obviously, Smedley Butler's been dead for 70 years, but he wrote a book, War as a Racket. But I think it's just his speech. But there is a book that I got all of this from called The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. I'll email it to you after this. That book, it paints it all out. And it is, I mean, it almost you feel like you're reading a fiction book because you're like, I've never heard of any of this. This isn't real. This is a really nice conspiracy book that would probably be a good movie. But then you go and look all of it up, and there it all is. And you're like, what is this? They tried to overthrow FDR, the grandfather of a sitting president, not a sitting president, a former president. But I've been talking about that book a lot the last month or two because it's really kind of reshaped my entire view of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And right now I'm listening to The War State by Michael Swanson, which is kind of about it's about what Eisenhower warned about, the military industrial complex. Beware of the military industrial complex and its influences in our government, and kind of how that's the underlying theme. It's like, it doesn't matter who you elect. It doesn't. Sure, you can have Johnson's Great Society, and then you can have Reagan's military build up, and then you can have Clinton, canceling the debt, and then you can have Obama and Trump. What he's arguing is that from the viewpoint of these corporations, these massive machines and supply lines and trade lines, none of that matters.
Mm.
None of it matters. It's the puppet over here and the puppet over here, and meanwhile there's just a steel wall moving forward, and it doesn't matter whether or not you want to stop it. And it's yeah, it's that's what I've learned from reading a bunch about this. But yeah, so to say all that to say, there are more things that you've learned similar to that, where you just said as you realize that maybe everyone really is just trying their hardest.
I mean, that's an oversimplification, but
Sure.
I get struck by that because yeah, there's a lot of duplicity, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of backs, infighting on all sorts of things, geopolitically as well as other things. But I guess I'm always struck by the we kind of view history often in terms of great actors, and probably one of the few great actors that I one of the sad things about reading a lot of history is that icons tend to get kind of dusted up a little bit. The pedestal gets knocked around quite a bit, and the gold edge comes off. And you
Mm-hmm.
start, all these people are really flawed. But somebody who has really impressed me as I've read a bunch of narrated a bunch of books about him, I think is a great American, if I can use the word hero, that isn't talked about enough, is George Marshall.
Okay.
General George
Yeah,
Marshall
Marshall Plan.
wasn't, not a battlefield commander or anything like that. Ran the Pentagon during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
but probably we would not have succeeded had he not. First of all, his brilliant thing was raising Eisenhower out of relative obscurity into a position of great. He understood people and how to use people. His only failure or biggest failure was really after he was retired. He was pulled out of retirement to go to China to try to broker a deal between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work. I mean, it was like, but that was, and he knew it. And it was too bad. It's kind of a poor coda to the end of a brilliant career. But he first time in history, I think anyone ever tried to do something that he got the American people behind and the government behind to do the Marshall Plan.
Mm-hmm.
Turned enemies into allies and rebuilt a shattered economy, not coincidentally driving the greatest economic expansion of the United States in
Ever.
world history. So it was a win-win-win-win-win. But a really but he was somebody that never seemed to really care about if he got the credit or not. He was
Mm.
surrounded by really egomaniacs, MacArthur, Patton, Eisenhower not so much, but
A little bit.
there's a lot of egos. You don't
Yeah.
get far without a big ego.
Yeah.
And but he just seemed to not. Oh, and dealing with the military, especially the Navy people, Nimitz and so forth, after Pearl Harbor, just trying to get us focused in terms of getting into the war and stuff like that. Really impressive. I recommend you reading some more stuff about him, and I'll think of some of the books that I read that really impressed me with him specifically.
Okay.
I think he's an under-recognized figure. Everybody knows about him, but they don't really know anything about him.
I certainly don't. Yeah.
That's the way he lived. He just did his job.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
he just
And
do it really well for the most part. He had his failures, like everybody, but that's somebody that really has come through to me over time. Is instead of being diminished by what I've read about him, instead of all the clay starting to stick to their feet, he's somebody that seems to come through stronger and stronger the more I read about him.
that's very fascinating because you're right. You're right. Is somebody trying to join this Zoom meeting? Something's in the waiting room. I don't know who that is. Is That's never happened before. But yeah, you're right. Excuse me?
I'm not here.
I'm not here. You're right though that a common theme, reading about Patton or reading about MacArthur, JFK, Reagan. You read about all these guys, and you're right. The gold sheen starts to come off, and you're like, oh man. You're like, and in a weird way, I kind of enjoy that because it makes me feel like when you see how human they are, you start to go, oh, okay, like maybe I could do that. Not saying I'm going to be president, but I mean, he's like, you realize that these people aren't infallible. You're like,
Oh,
oh,
they are human. They
yeah. And that, I think
are,
it's good.
yeah, it's important to know, and it's important for us to not, we are so quick to judge as people, and especially now with our sort of cancel culture,
I know.
somebody just steps out of line a second, it's like their whole life is erased.
Shing, just
And
take them out.
I, I mean, I think it's a okay. I think it's a phase that will pass and people will
Yeah.
return, but to a more balanced view. I've always been that way. I kind of, because that's the way I am myself. I'm kind of moderate in most things.
Yeah.
I'm not extreme political one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. I think it's a phase. I think what we're going through right now, I'm sure that, I mean, we've kind of been through something like this before in
Well,
terms of insanity, right? The 60s.
well, 68 was
Yeah.
by far a more violent time with
Kent State.
major assassinations, destruction in the streets on a level that we hadn't seen in years. Ironically, we seem to go through this in this country with depressing regularity. You can go back to some of the labor union fights in the 30s. I mean, this country hung on a knife edge between going full communist or full fascist,
A
you
couple
know,
times.
couple times. Because it was so extreme, and some people would say if it wasn't for World War II, which kind of forced everybody to focus on something else, we might not have made it.
Yeah, if that's not a chilling reality,
There
is
were
like,
times before that, in the some of the, I think 1876 was another one, that election of that year. Uh, uh,
yeah, where it went for like 100 days past the vote, or
and then let's look at some of the stuff before the Civil War.
mhm.
1850.
Yeah.
Around the time of Dred Scott. I mean, I was just reading about, somebody was talking, because of there's been a lot of talk lately since January 6th about,
Mhm,
the militarization of people in Congress and stuff
mhm.
like that. And this one writer was talking about should have should have been in the House of Representatives in 1850. That I think one of the northern representatives counted 78 southern representatives who came on the floor packing their guns out in the open and basically saying, you disagree with me, I will cudgel you, and I may take you
Awesome.
outside.
That's awesome.
We've had
Awesome.
uh, and I mean, and I've read about those, events where, they got into such anger and they just beat the hell out of each other right there on the, so
That's
we,
amazing.
we've had some inflamed tempers
Yeah.
more
Yeah,
than once, and
absolutely. I mean, Andrew Jackson used to duel with his enemies and then kill them.
yeah, so that, I mean, not to minimize any of the issues that are
Sure.
happening now, but I kind of view it as like, if you cast a cold eye on history, it's like, yeah, it's it's bad. We've been through bad stuff before. Somehow, most of the time, cooler minds prevail, and we move on in some way. Uh,
What I always point to is we got through the Cuban Missile Crisis. To me, I look at that and I'm like, we got
another
through that.
another knife edge. Could
The
have gone,
knife edge of all knife edges.
yeah, could have gone way wrong.
And not only that, it's not just that we had, oh, the Soviets, all of JFK's military advisors, they were all pushing for, let's nuke them right now. I mean, he had his own men saying,
Yeah,
let's do it. I mean, Lemitzer, LeMay, they were all, bro,
LeMay is a piece of work, I have to say. At least what I've read about him.
he's, he's, I have a love hate with him. I mean, you got to just love the hard charging. I mean, I got to respect it. I mean, he always was at the front of his bomber formations.
But he was wrong so often, and he just kept going on.
It
This
just
air
brushed it
power,
off.
air power will always win a war. No, it never has, never will.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
hasn't yet,
Yeah.
and so yeah, eh, he's something. He's
LeMay, he was something else. I mean, I think it was not 63. I think it was before that, but there's a quote of him where he used to run. Obviously, he was put in charge of a strategic air command and Operation Chrome Dome, where they had the constantly always in air B-50. I mean, think Doctor Strange of. But he had this thing where he used to take at the time like some of our first supersonic bombers, I think B-47s or 57 Hustlers, and he would take whole fleets of them, and he would have them full afterburners go over the Arctic Circle directly at the Soviet Union. And then not until right at the edge of like their waters, whatever international waters are, he'd have them all slow down and then just do a sharp UE.
Yeah.
He said he was training his men for what it would look like, but obviously we never gave the Soviets any warning of what we were doing.
Right.
And every once in a while, like, I think he did this like twice. And, might have been Kennedy, it might have been Eisenhower. They're like, hey, like they thought that this was war, and like we just squeaked by. They made like a back channel call, and we told them it's just a drill. And LeMay said, with a little more luck, we would have had World War III. Like this guy was chomping at the bit, and
Yeah.
I
Well,
think
they were looking at what they considered to be a final solution. I'll use it advisedly, a final solution to the political
to the communist problem, yeah, that's what they viewed it as.
and, yeah.
Yeah, it's JFK said, you don't want LeMay deciding whether or not you go into battle. But if you are going into battle, you want LeMay leading the charge.
I think actually that's true of a whole bunch of our generals,
Sure.
Patton, MacArthur, others. That once you're engaged, Sherman, they're
Yeah.
they're they're really good.
Release
They
the dogs. Yeah.
release the dogs, but keep that dog chained up.
Yeah. That dog doesn't get to decide when the leash comes off, right?
Yeah, keep it in its kennel with a muzzle.
Yes.
And
Yes.
but yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
if you need them, great.
I have a question.
Sure.
This is fun, but what made you think that I would be some? Because I kind of consider myself. I'm certainly not an expert about anything. I'm a talking head. I narrate other people's words and stuff. What made you think that I would be interesting to talk to?
I don't know, man. Some people I just look at and I go, people always ask me, they're like, what's the topic of this podcast? And I always tell them, I have no topic. I like Cold War. I like biology. I like the future of space travel. I mean, but those are some things I like. But it'd be like if you loved football, and everyone's like, oh, so you're gonna do a football, so you love watching football. The reality is you probably like watching any sport where someone dedicates themselves to the game and just goes the extra mile, whether it's cricket or checkers. I really like talking to people that are passionate about something. I don't sure maybe if it's about stuff we like similarly, like we're doing right now, you can kind of vibe a little more. But I mean, I've had on people that paint, I've people that write sci-fi, people that stuff I know nothing about and never will. I just like when someone's passionate about anything.
Speaking of sports, one of the few books that I've ever narrated that really got, not for me necessarily as a narrator, because again, just the talking head, but the author got kind of hammered. It was a biography of Walter Payton called Sweetness
Okay.
by Jeff Pearlman, the author. It's really good, but the bottom line is Walter Payton was a sad individual.
Really?
Kind of a, fantastic, incredible and gifted athlete, but basically a permanent child in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
He never had the maturity to really grasp the stuff that was happening to him, and as you read the book, it just kind of he never felt like he was recognized properly. So there was a need there and stuff, and it just had one tremendous accomplishment after another, in terms of sports. But it's one of the saddest books I ever read. And boy, did the people in Chicago not want anyone to say anything bad about Walter Payton. So this poor author got kind of hammered for basically presenting a fairly unvarnished portrait of a person who kind of, after he left the game, kind of diminished into he became kind of a sad spectacle, not an alcoholic or anything like that,
Yeah.
but kind of a shadow of what was there before. And it was sad. It was one of the saddest books I've ever read.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was the case. Flip side, this guy also wrote another book called Showtime, which was about the the Magic Johnson era
Mhm.
Lakers.
Mhm.
That was a hoot and a half.
Really?
At that time I had my son. My son's about is 30, 31 or 32. He was a basketball player, and I was too in high school. And but at that time, he was home from college, and when I was doing that book, and I had him engineer for me, so he really didn't know anything about other than
Right.
Magic Johnson is a legend, blah blah blah. But you
Yeah.
don't really know. And so I'd be narrating stuff, and then my son would be going and he'd click me over the thing and say, "Did that really happen?
Yeah.
You really do that?" And I'd say, let's YouTube it.
Yeah.
And we would watch it. And I mean, to see Magic Johnson in his prime, I had forgotten just what a phenomenally gifted athlete he was. And now a lot of the things that he did then seem somewhat commonplace. It's not so uncommon to see a guy 6'9", playing a point
Yeah.
guard.
Yeah.
It's unusual, but it's not uncommon. But he kind of broke the mold totally.
Yeah.
And that was so much fun, and it was great fun to share that with my son, because it's one thing to talk about it; it's another thing to actually see it.
Yeah.
And
It's all relative. You're right. I mean, you see someone now do something in sports and you're like, yeah, I get it. You have to go back and look at what was the norm for the time. I mean, like Bill Russell and Red Auerbach, like winning like 10 out of 11 championships or something. Like that's insane.
because competition is competition,
Yeah,
and
period.
you know, you still got to beat the best of the best at the time.
Of your time. Yeah. I mean, Babe Ruth might not be that impressive if he played right now. He might.
Probably wouldn't be. And of course, there's a lot of argument there too, in terms of there were probably guys in the Negro leagues at the time that that
Oh, yeah.
that that could have
Pummeled him.
bested him, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. But it doesn't change the fact that for a guy that did everything wrong, if you see some of those pictures of him, uh, I mean, he's a heavy drinker. He's got this gigantic beer gut. He's got these spindly little legs. Where did he get the power? Because the power all comes from the lower body. And
Yeah.
where did he get the power to hit like that? It's you look at him and go, okay, a freak of nature somehow,
Yeah.
but great fun to watch.
Yeah.
Some of the old cinescopes and stuff.
Yeah, you have those stories, right? I mean, like a Ted Williams, you're like, "Oh, this guy would have been the best hitter of all time," but, oh, sorry, he went and flew fighter jets in World War II for a couple years at his prime.
I read another biography about a narrated one about by uh, uh, Learson. I can't remember his first name now. About Ty Cobb,
Mhm.
and another iconic figure that you don't know about. All we know is that he's a dirty player.
Yeah,
Not,
yeah,
and it's like, wow, that's sort of like the people that came after him, kind of, or maybe some of his victims, writing the narrative about him, because he certainly was not any dirtier than any other player of his time.
yeah,
He
just
was
got
a
caught.
fierce competitor, and you just look at his stats. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, for not, it's too, but
yeah,
that was another one that was.
we had a book when I was growing up, I think it was at my grandparents' house, and it was an old book then when I was little, but I used to read it, and that's one thing I always remembered. I was reading, I was like, "How come we never hear about Ty Cobb?" And, like, I don't even like baseball, but I was always like, "There's a guy that was, like, the original Babe Ruth." It was, like, 20 years before him, right? It was, like, 1902, 1903, yeah. Yeah, and,
He had about 4 or 5 years where he was just, uh, but during those years he was tremendous.
yeah,
You
yeah. It's you always learn there are weird stories like that though where you learn the background and you're like, "Does anyone else know about this?" I mean, tomorrow I'm having on Ben Westhoff, he's an author, I've had him on once before, he wrote the book Fentanyl Inc., but, he also wrote a book, yeah, that was a heavy one, but he wrote a book called, Original Gangsters, and it's the rise of, like, East Coast, West Coast hip hop, and I just
know,
finished that. Man, one thing I took away from that is I never knew that George H.W. Bush and Laura Bush, or yeah, Laura. Is it Laura or Barbara? Was George H.W. with Barbara?
George H.W. was Barbara.
George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush.
That's 41, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, the older one, yeah.
Yeah.
He and his wife lived in Compton for 2 years. Like straight out of Compton. They lived there, and that's because that was the main point for apparently embarkation or disembarkation for troops going to the South Pacific during World War II. They came back. You had the GI Bill. You had a bunch of really affordable housing catered to them, and then you had all these defense contractors in Southern Cali, and it was just kind of like, hey, here's a good place to plant our feet. But George and Barbara Bush lived in Compton, straight out of Compton.
That's a great detail. First
Yeah,
thing, yeah.
yeah, it's little things like that always stick out to me where I'm just like, that's fantastic. Um, if you want a book that is one of my favorite books because it really, to me, I was telling my dad the other day, no one book has shed more light onto World War II for me than Blitzed by Norman Ohler. It's I'll email that one to you as well because that's how much it sticks out to me, and it's an in-depth history of Hitler and the Nazi high command's drug use. And my God, this guy, and I always say this line, so I'm sure people are rolling their eyes. He made Hunter S. Thompson look like a teetotaler. Hitler was in. I mean, obviously we know, but I mean, in terms of drugs, I mean, insane. Legitimately
What was he using?
everything. Absolutely everything. He would wake up in the morning, he would get a shot of amphetamine, and then he'd also get like morphine and Eucadol, and it was the original Speedball, the thing that killed Chris Farley. He would wake up and that's what he would do in the morning. He'd go up to his castle in the mountains, and apparently he would get really high on meth, and he would do impressions of the World War One machine guns to Eva Braun, which, if you actually stop and dissect that, means that Hitler, high as a kite, was going by himself up in the mountains. Like his doctor, Dr. Theodore Morell, he would just make up concoctions for Hitler because Hitler always wanted to be on the cutting edge of things. So he would take like the testicles of bulls and like the blood of lions. He would mix it with phosphoric acid and like vitamin B. He'd put it in ampules and then inject Hitler with it in the morning. He said
And
towards the end,
then pick
his
him off the ceiling later.
Oh yeah, no, but he said at the end of his life, Hitler, they said his blood was so coagulated, it came out like jelly when he would, because he was on so many, I mean, what Erwin Rommel, the amount of meth that those guys were on and the stories of them kind of, and I didn't know this, but the Blitzkrieg wasn't planned as a Blitzkrieg. It was in hindsight they realized what it was. At the time, there was no big plan for that. The plan was, sure, I mean, like any invasion or beginning of a war, surprise, violence of action, hit them hard, fog of war. But when Rommel would report back from where they were, Hitler thought that he's like, no. He's like, that can't be right because I'm looking at the map and that would mean that you went 400 miles last night. And he'd be like, correct. And he was like, what the hell? But like, that's what happened. So this whole thing that unfolded, it wasn't planned. This whole thing happened. Kind of like what we were saying about history earlier. It's in hindsight that we put it in these neat little boxes and we say World War One, World War II, the Great Depression, but there is no borders. It's all blended together like tie dye. It's like they didn't know. It wasn't until hindsight that, because they didn't do it again. So this wasn't their game plan. They just looked back and they went, that was, I guess, a lightning war. It happened like that. It is insane. And then Goering, or was it Goering, I think, the head of the Luftwaffe.
Yeah, Goering.
So when they had the British at Dunkirk and they were closing in for the kill, Goering, every morning he would wake up and take out his like custom made like porcelain and chrome syringe, and he would take a huge hit of morphine because he was wounded, and I think World War One as well as the Reichstag fire. He got addicted to morphine. But he would just get high as a kite every morning, and he and Hitler would go out into the woods. Hitler would wake up and take it was called Pervitin. It was their cap form of meth. Came in, it looked like Mentos. They said it was like Pervitin. You peel back a little foil and you take your hit of meth. They would take that and go into the woods in the morning and just talk. And Goering was like, no, I have, high as a kite on morphine, was like, I have this plan. He's like, let's not finish off the British at Dunkirk with ground forces. He was like, the Luftwaffe, they will come in like their Stuka dive bombers. They call it the Horns of Jericho because they're so loud. And they'd be like, it's going to be this glorious propaganda win. We're going to go in there. We're going to bomb them on the beaches. And then Hitler, high as a kite on meth, completely different high versus morphine. he would always look at it as like, yes, he wants these big propaganda wins, and he was like, and I need to use that because he always pit his top generals against each other so that they would never come at him, divide and conquer. So he was on board. So they called this whole thing. Meanwhile, the British generals are saying it will take a miracle at Dunkirk for us to not be finished, and that's exactly what happened.
They got 3 days or
Op-
something.
Operation Barbarossa. So he would go. Hitler was like, I want to go take Russia right now. His generals, they said it was so stressful to go into that room with him to have his meetings at the Wolf's Lair
Right.
that eventually Tador Morell would start to come to them, and it'd be like, you're visiting the in-laws and you throw back an extra drink. It's like he would go to the generals and be like, I can help you guys out if you want to go deal with Hitler. So he would start giving them Pervitin, meth, or Eucadol, which was the original like codeine. So his generals started to go into their high, because back when they were sober, whenever someone would voice up Hitler, this is not smart. We can't take on Russia during the winter. Like historically, that doesn't work. And he was fired. Sometimes he'd disappear. So these other generals were like, screw it. So they started drinking the Kool-Aid. They would take their Pervitin pills. They would get shots of Eucadol. So now they were on speedballs. So they would go in and start reading their own press reports. So Hitler would be like, I want everyone to go to Russia. And they were all like, hell yeah, let's do it. And that's how this stuff unfolded. And you look at it now and you're like, I had this big view of World War II, and I now realize a whole lot of the reason why the world is the way it is today, that we're speaking, hi, I'm Tommy, instead of Isha Liba Thomas, is because these guys didn't know how to put down the needle. And like,
this is an incredible story. This almost sounds like it would make a great absurdist black comedy. You
yes,
know,
like a Quentin Tarantino movie.
yeah, exactly. That's what it sounds like.
Yes, dude. Okay, before you read The Plot to Seize the White House, you need to read Blitz by Norman. I listened to that book. I swear to
Norman Ohler.
Norman Ohler,
Oh,
Ohler.
HLER.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had him on this podcast, and we talked about that.
Wow.
I listened.
How did he get this? Where did he get the story from? I mean, where did the research emerge
He
from?
goes into it in the book. He builds all of it up. He'll break chapters apart and be like, it'll be like this. He'll be teaching history, and then it will like be back to present day, visiting DC, going into the archives, meeting with the heads of these former pharmaceutical companies in Germany. A lot of stuff that it was declassified, but just no one really put everything together. He gets Tador Morell's journal, his doctor, and he starts to paint this whole picture. And then you start to realize, like, holy shit, like, and it just, and I mean, it spirals off into more and more insanity, and then obviously ends with Hitler's suicide and downfall. But I listen to that when I have an author. I'll listen. Obviously, I'll listen to their book at least once. A lot of times, I'll listen to it twice because I want to just get a better understanding of it. Whatever. I listened to Blitz. I'm not exaggerating. 8 times in a row. I couldn't stop listening to it. I was I was laughing maniacally. I'd be driving to work. I worked at a liquor store this past summer, and I'd be talking to people at work. I'd be like, "Did you know this about Hitler?" And it'd be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" But I couldn't stop talking about it because I was like, "Does anyone else know about this story?" It was like a New York Times bestseller. He's become like he's a huge author now.
I'd love to check that out because that sounds like that'd be great. That'd be great.
Dude, if I were you, I keep saying, dude, sir.
That's
I
all
would,
right.
okay, dude. I would go get that book, like, get it yesterday and just start listening. I mean, there's no build up. You'll be 3 minutes in and you'll be like, holy, it's one of those things that it's from the get. There's no slow and steady. You turn it on and within 4 minutes, you're like, honey, shut up. You're like, what is going on? You listen to this and it's just how it escalates and how
Yeah.
it goes into crazier things than you'd ever
Well, a
imagine.
lot of crazy things make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
A lot of decisions that were made that were like inexplicable. Except, yeah, if you got a room full of people who are higher than the proverbial heights,
Yeah.
uh, they're making some irrational
Yeah.
leaps of faith. So
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it also a lot of this stuff makes sense. I know we got 5 more minutes. Is Germania, right? The city he wanted to build, where he wanted a dome that was it was going to be able to hold like 300,000 people. He wanted to rip up all the railways in Europe, and he wanted to put in these double wide railways and create these new German trains that would have been like 3 stories. He wanted to put a laser in space to redirect light at undesirables, and it all makes a lot of sense when you look back and you go, oh, they were on meth.
yeah, it does.
These delusions, right? It's
It does.
like a late 2000s, early 2010s Charlie Sheen. it kind of makes sense. You go, oh, okay. Like the things they were doing. It's it's 2020 in the United States. In the last 18 months or so, we've got like a working prototype of a railgun. Hitler wanted a railgun in the 40s. I mean, just that's how you can look at it. Is but yeah, everything about it makes sense. His crazy moves. Why did we do this? I mean, a lot of American generals at the time, they did not know why in the world they didn't continue at Dunkirk.
Yeah.
They were hesitant to move forward because they were like, is this are we being kind of toyed into something? What are we? Is he just this master chess player? No, he was. And then even funnier is when his high would come down and his generals would be like, all right, we've moved 100,000 men into to Soviet Union. I swear to God, Hitler would say, I'm not interested in that today. And they'd be like, what are you talking about? We've just opened up a two-front war. And he'd say, I'm not interested in that today. And he would go on, maybe he would be on painkillers for a week. And he was very like, maybe we should slow down the war effort. Maybe we should. And then everyone would be like, okay. And then he'd take a hit of Pervitin and he'd be like, we need to invade every country on the planet. Like, to me, that book tied up more loose ends about World War II than any other book has done for me. Probably any other 10 books has done for me. And I know I just talked your ear off for the last 10 minutes.
No,
Sorry.
it makes you wonder because there's someone else who just left office who has been that erratic in terms of
Yeah.
their decision making, and
Yeah.
you wonder what was he taking? Because
Well,
I've often you see Trump at speeches and
yeah.
you know
Well,
and
that's
you wonder
that.
what was he on?
Well, that's the
And
thing is that's when I was talking to Norman Oler. This was like November, and I go, "Are you going to write a book one day about Trump in the White House?" Because that's the thing, right? Trump, notoriously doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. No one in Germany, aside from his innermost circle, knew what he was doing.
yeah,
He supposedly at the end of World War I on November 11th, 1919, or 18, he threw his last pack of cigarettes into the river because I had to keep those things away from my body. So the whole image was, I'm this sober guy. I am your leader. In reality is he makes like Jimi Hendrix look like a straight edged arrow. Like, so that's what I asked Mr. Oler. I was like, are we going to get a book on Trump one day? Far off in the future when it's all declassified, are we going to get a book on Trump one day? And he was like, I don't know. I think so, maybe. I was like, that's what I think, man, is we're going to get a book on like, oh, 10 feet higher. Like, all Mexicans are rapists. We're going to be like, oh, okay. He was on some good stuff.
click.
Click. And you go, oh, I get it. And it's, yeah, that's, I don't really know. Yeah.
Or cleaning up the mess.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I was like, we need a book on that. And I want him to segue into all of the Nazis coming to the United States. And then as we went with the creation of MK Ultra, I wanted him to segue into that. Because I'll leave you with this. I didn't know this, but at the death camps, towards the very end, they actually started testing on subjects things like ayahuasca and early forms of LSD, which I can't imagine a worse place to trip than an actual
Yeah.
concentration camp. But if you read what the reports say, it was you could say it was a precursor to what would become MK Ultra. And so I've been begging Mr. Oler. I'm like, we need a part 2 to Blitzed. I want him to do a part 1 and a part 3. I think Blitzed is the middle. I think he needs to do a whole book on alcohol between 1933 and 1940 and how that was responsible for a lot of it. And then I wanted him to do like an MK Ultra book, but ultimately I'm just a crazy 30-year-old sitting in Maryland and he's this renowned author. So I'm not sure how serious he took my advice, but
I don't know if writers, if someone has a good idea and they're not feeling proprietary about it, you'll pick
yeah.
up on it.
Yeah. So, but I said I'd only keep you for an hour, so we'll wrap this up. But Mr. Malcolm Hillgartner, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a really pleasure to talk to you, Tommy. I mean, you're talk about a far-reaching conversation. It's been fun.
Yeah. Well, hey man, if you ever want to come back on and talk about history or shoot the shit, I'm down, man. I enjoyed it. I had no idea what we were going to talk about today, and it kind of all unfolded as it always does. And you're a cool dude, man. So I'll send you the links to those 2 books if you want to listen to it. Man, if you want to come back on and shoot the shit, I would love to. If not, that's cool too. You don't need to answer right now. You can sit on it. But I'll email you those books, and thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure, like I said.
Awesome. All right, man. I'll send you the link when this is uploaded. It'll probably be sometime tomorrow morning.
Great.
All right. God bless you. Have a good